So the title of my presentation is Political Change and Counterfactual Thoughts, a discussion from semiotics. And here I listed the key terms of that title again: political change, counterfactual thoughts, and semiotics, because these are a bit the signifiers that I have been trying to use when thinking from a semiotic perspective about politics, and this is something that I've been struggling with for a while, trying to find the differences between a semiotic approach and a discursive approach to the political realm. Probably we are all very familiar with the Essex school of discourse analysis, with the work of Ernesto Laclau or Laclau, the eternal discussion how to pronounce this, and Chantal Mouffe, and so on. And I have seen, because of my education in South America, a lot of commonalities with the thought of Eliseo Verón, which he was a famous semiotician who focused on studying from a declared semiotic perspective social discourses. So my research is, I say that it's in the field of semiotics, but of course it has a lot of things in common with political theory, with practical philosophy, and with psychology. And what I will present in these 10-15 minutes draws a lot from these disciplines, especially conceptual. So we discussed at the end of the previous session, or Mr. Carpentier asked what changes or how we conceive change, right? And that's where I think, of course, it's tricky. It's hard to come up with a definition that is not obvious, right? Change is something that implies something being different from something. But I think in this case that semiotics, and specifically the Semiotic Square, this is a tool that Alguirdas Greimas introduced to explain the logical relations between the concepts that are at the underlying discourse, can be helpful here, because I don't know if you're familiar with this semiotic square, but the idea is that we have a value that is in this case S1, and in this case it can be the present political situation, and there are some kind of logical relations. If we go to the right into the square, there will be a term that is contrary to it, but that is not contradictory. So in this case, if we are discussing a political situation, or we define it as S1, its negation would be not or non-S1. So if we want the political situation to change, so here in Brussels, in Belgium, there is an issue that we're not happy with it, we want it to change. So there are different ways of imagining change. Number one is as a negation of the current situation, and another one is by creating another position that might imply a negation of the current situation, but that not necessarily. And I know this might be tricky because it's based on logic, but I think what I will say now might elucidate this. So when thinking about political change, I really try to pay attention to the difference between the current, the possible, and the plausible. And when thinking about possible scenarios, plausible scenarios, alternative worlds, let's say, the imagination plays a key role there, and specifically political imagination. That is a term that I will explain now a bit, because here a former professor of mine in Uruguay, Gustavo Pereira, worked recently a lot from a practical philosophical account on trying to understand how political imagination is a key element for the autonomy of individuals. From a discursive perspective, from a semiotic perspective, and I repeat that it's not very clear to me which the differences are between discourse analysis and semiotics, as what matters is discourse, right? In a macro perspective, as it was said in the first session. For these approaches, politics is seen as a contest over meaning, right? It's not so much about policies, it's more about, okay, how do we articulate a public sphere or better, how do political actors articulate a public sphere that is based on creating meaning, on coming with specific proposals that should convince voters, let's say, in order for them to adhere to this proposal. Yeah. And as we know, I assume from discourse theory, and specifically the work of Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, who draw from Carl Schmitt, his book from the 1930s. And this is something that Eliseo Verón as well recognizes and further develops, is the idea that politics, yeah, and this can be party politics, but also politics within a smaller unit or polis, has always an adversative or polemic or antagonistic or conflictive nature. So there will be different views that will try to compete in order to be the norm or to be fulfilled. Yeah? And as we know, Chantal Mouffe proposes that this relationship can take two different forms, now, the agonistic and the antagonistic. So let me dip a bit in the concept of political imagination, right? Because this is something that I think adds a lot of clarity to the conception from a semiotic, social semiotic perspective of change. Gustavo Pereira, this philosopher still working in Uruguay, he published recently this very interesting book in English as well. I will present the reference at the end of my presentation. Says that imagination grants individuals the possibility of envisioning possible scenarios that are not present and that are considered as a possible future. Yeah? When conceiving political imagination, that I repeat this, is a way of putting into practice or making an exercise of imagination within the political domain, yeah, requires some inputs from psychology. For example, this idea of counterfactual thoughts, yeah, the idea of thinking or being capable of imagining how things might have been or how things might be, yeah. And this is something that has been theorized by Ruth Byrne from I think it's University College in Dublin. Yeah, this kind of thought that is a way of imagining, it's a way of exercising creativity, but that nevertheless is anchored in what is plausible, what is doable, what might be the case, right? For example, if we go to science fiction, yeah, there are things that we might believe that have some kind of verisimilitude, yeah, that they somehow are credible to us, yeah, les vraisemblables. I'm not sure how to translate this in English, but nevertheless, we know that they are not possible. Yeah? If we see a war between bands of unicorns, we might follow the story and understand the plot, but we know that this won't happen. When imagining in the realm of politics, this is different, yeah? And that's why here this distinction that is key to semiotics between the actual and the virtual, yeah? What is there and what is in absentia, what is not present, might be enlightening, especially when we conceive which are the basic mechanisms of political imagination. And of course, in this general and maybe way too theoretical approach I am proposing, representations play a key role. You know? How ideas are represented, are brought to life, are conveyed by specific semiotic resources, which can of course be of different nature. They can be words, they can be images, and can be manifestos, and so on. So in the book I am quoting from Gustavo Pereira. He says, it would be very difficult to conceive free subjects who are not capable of representing states of affairs different from those they experience, or not capable of self-determination, or not able to distance themselves from their desires and beliefs, identify with them, and adopt them to make the corresponding course of action. Yeah, so going back to the discussion we had in the first session, discourse has an impact on the world. Yeah, there is a pragmatic dimension to discourse. People do things, people vote, people might go to war because of the influence these discourses have. Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think how the in absentia, the virtual states of affairs that might be the case as an alternative to the political present might be influencing as well, or actually influence this, the sphere of praxis, right, of action. This idea, of course, relates closely to this concept presented by Arjuna Padurai in a book from 2013 that is called The Future as a Cultural Fact. And he refers there to the capacity to aspire, and he defines it as a navigational capacity that is nurtured by the possibility of real-world conjectures and refutations, again emphasizing the idea of that there needs to be an anchorage on reality, on what might be the case. And Reinhard Koselleck, in a book about the future, he speaks or he proposes this concept of a rational prognosis, yeah? Thinking about the future, thinking about how things might differ from the current state of affairs rationally, right? So my question, and I think this is the most interesting point for a semiotic or social semiotic approach to how we conceive change within the political realm, is a question, okay, about the matter of imagination. Imagination based on what? How do people imagine? Yeah, how can I, as a citizen, imagine a situation that is alternative to the political present? How does a political party imagine and construct an alternative so that people can vote for it? Yeah. And here, I think it was Ulrike at the end of the last session, she mentioned this idea of some sort of determinism. Yeah. Padurai in the book from 2013 says, it is in culture that ideas of the future, as much as of those about the past, are embedded and nurtured. Yeah. And this, of course, the idea of culture is always tricky, but of course, I think here it's evident that culture is conceived following Clifford Geertz, right, as this web of significations, like a spider web in which we human beings are embedded, and therefore we move ourselves based on the pathways that we find on the strings of that web. In my research, I have always also found, and this is a concept that was mentioned before, the concept of social imaginary, right? These sets of articulated beliefs and ideas that don't necessarily have a clear representation or are not clearly expressed, but nevertheless are at the basis of how people imagine their being together. Charles Taylor, this is, I think, a classic quote. Social imaginary refers to the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. Something that has been of my interest in recently, and it's something I'm working on now, is just as an example, there are many, many ways in which change is envisaged, it's imagined, is how dystopic literature, George Orwell 1984, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale more recently, how these fictional products have been the source in order to make that imagination more visible and to anchor, to have some kind of anchorage or bring down to reality the game, the thought game or the imaginative game of thinking how things might be different. And these are only a couple of images, right? The Handmaid's Tale, we know it has been a repository of resources, for example, in order to enact a feminist movement. This is a picture from Uruguay. Yeah, try to focus where Uruguay is, far down in the south of South America, far away from the center of the world. Things take time to arrive there, but nevertheless, when the series of the Handmaid's Tale was published in 2017, there was really a surge of the feminist movement, the local feminist movement, who started using the resources of this novel as a way not of necessarily proposing a new alternative political system, but this as a way to criticize the current one. So if you remember the Semiotic Square I showed at the very beginning, feminists in Uruguay are not satisfied with the political situation, they are not necessarily proposing an alternative one, but they are imagining something that opposes the current situation. And that's why, for example, they reach out to this kind of semiotic resources that are, of course, very, very Instagrammable, let's say, no? Colors, uniforms, and so on. The same happened in Argentina, especially in Buenos Aires, where there is a big debate nowadays. It's not a new story about the legalization of abortion, with this very classic green handkerchief as a sign of the pro-abortion movement. And we see that the ideas or imaginaries taken from Margaret Atwood's novel are playing a role there as well as semiotic resources. Just to conclude, it's not a conclusion, it's more an opening. Things that have been of my interest, and I think that we could discuss later in the half an hour we'll have for discussion. There are a couple of things, for example, the uses of the present and of the past in the discursive articulation of the future. For semiotics, for discourse studies, the present and the past don't exist as things per se, but they are discursive constructions that we do, right? When I tell my story, how I'm a Uruguayan guy living in Belgium, I tell a story and I construct that past based on specific sets of narratives. And the same here, how the past is represented, how the present is represented and used as the starting point for the imagination of an alternative reality. Second point of interest, the segmentation of this approach based on the different political actors. How does a candidate speak? How does a party as a collective enunciator present and represent and imagine alternative futures? I don't know if it's your perspective, but when, for example, in my case, in my research in the Uruguayan and Argentinian political landscape, usually politics is based on a negation of what the opponent says, not necessarily coming up with a new proposal, right? And I think this is interesting to see the underlying structures that are there as the basis of political action. Third point, how representations structure political exchanges. How the content of the Handmaid's Tale becomes part of the articulation of discourses and negotiation of meaning about specific political topics. The mediation of fictional worlds, the case of Atwood is an example, but there are many others, and so on. So I hope it was more or less clear the approach I wanted to present. I'm sorry if it remained on a theoretical level. Here I leave the references: Apadurai, Barn, Moff, and Taylor. I assume everyone knows them. Pereira, the book of Gustavo Pereira is called in English Impulse, Rationality, and Besiege Imagination. And then some reference to Felicia Oberon. So that would be it from my side, and I'm looking forward to the discussion at the end of the session. Thank you.